Good morning, fam. So today we find ourselves starting the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews is an interesting letter because we don't know who the author is. And it's there's no introduction. It's no, hey, this is Paul, writing to whomever. It just comes right out the gate and says, hey, listen, long ago, God spoke to us through prophets, and now more recently, he has spoken to us through his son, Jesus. And so that's how it starts. So the book of Hebrews begins as an argument in the sense that it's explaining why Jesus came and how he acquired salvation for us. I don't know if acquired is the right word. And so it's written to kind of the Jewish audience of the day because he goes in and through the Old Testament shows how Jesus is the Messiah, the Savior. So in chapter 1, he talks about how Jesus is God. In chapter 2, he talks about how Jesus is the one who brought about salvation to us and that all things are in subjection to him. Verse 8 says, he, God, left nothing that is not subject to him. Verse 9, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. And so it's talking about how Jesus alone is our salvation. And he says, listen, in chapter 3, there's been other people who God has appointed for things like Moses, and he talks about how Moses was appointed to lead his people, but that Jesus is better than Moses because A, he didn't fail, and B, he wasn't just leading him to a place, he was leading him to what chapter 4 calls the believer's rest, and that's our salvation. And in chapter 3, verse 12 and 13, he gives a warning. See to it, brothers, that there are not any one of you that has an evil and unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God, but encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. A couple verses later says, don't harden your hearts. And in the verse 1 of chapter 4, he says, therefore, let us fear, lest while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have fallen short of it. And he says, listen, the way that you know that you're saved is if you hang on to the end, that perseverance. And that starts with today. Today, if you hear his voice, respond. Verse 7 of chapter 4. And so he talks about how God has given us Christ, who has tasted death for everyone, so that we can enjoy his rest. And that's isn't that something that we all need, man? That we all are seeking for is rest. Then chapter 5. So I read the first five chapters. So chapter 5 is like, okay, but man, this is hard, right? How can I do all of this? And so he says, listen, Jesus understands. At the end of chapter 4, he was tempted in all ways like you are, yet without sin. And so in chapter 5, verse 2, being able then to deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, that's us, since he himself also is beset with weakness. And so God himself became a man and suffered all of these things, tasted death, as it says in Hebrews, so that we could enjoy believers' rest. So that's the first 5 chapters, and it just goes through this pattern of showing that this is something that God told us about from the prophets of the Old Testament, now through his Son. And then his Son was sacrificed on our behalf so that we can enjoy this rest. And the fact that God became man enables him to sympathize with our weaknesses too. And that's where we end today and pick up tomorrow.